Hello and welcome to this chapter about the external regulation of a business. Now, so far, we've really focused on sort of the effect of the market, of the free market. But we know that from time to time, that's got to be interfered with. The government have to tweak the free market in order to regulate different industries and different businesses. So in this chapter, we'll have a look at sort of why is that necessary? And because that is necessary, what sort of regulation is available to a government? And although we're looking at regulating the markets, we might also look at how do we regulate the people who operate within that market. Now, we won't do too much on this one because you've covered a lot of that already in your law paper, or you will if you haven't already taken your law paper. And then just briefly, a word about international aspects. So, why is regulation of a business necessary? Well, from time to time, the free market doesn't deliver, as we might say, economic efficiency. Sometimes it doesn't use resources in an efficient manner. Sometimes it doesn't deliver things which society requires. So what we need to do is have a look at that. So two key reasons why a business might need to be regulated. First of all, market failure. Now there's a section on that and the examiner does occasionally ask us about it. So we'll come back to that in a moment. The other one, externalities. Those hidden costs that the free market doesn't always consider, things like pollution or damage to the environment. And the public interest, which again, we'll come on to. Now, regulation is very widely defined, any form of state interference with the operation of the free market. And if we just look at this section 1.1 here, we can see how many different ways this might happen. First of all, the government might say, well, there's been a market failure. The market isn't doing what we need it to do, and the government has to intervene. One of those might be in the provision of public goods, things like street lighting, even roads and basic communications networks, which are provided by the government. Merit goods. We know merit goods. These are the things that you've probably seen them in your economics chapter. These are things that are good for us, that the government perceive as something that we should consume because they will help us. For instance, healthy foods, education, things like that. Goods that have a sort of extra benefit over and above their obvious worth. The government might decide to control the means of production through state ownership. Now, this is something in the UK that really is declining, but if you look back sort of through history, state ownership of the mines, state ownership of certain TV channels, the Royal Mail, the utility companies. So it still happens, but really not that much in the UK. Redistributing wealth. Now, this is a key point through our tax system. Okay, and we'll look in a moment at reasons why the government might choose to do that. Another way the government interferes with the free market is by creating demand. The government is one of the biggest purchasers of goods within our economy. And then the National Health Service is one of the biggest consumers within Europe. It's massive. Again, the government controls quite a lot of the purchasing power and policies of the NHS. So the government can create demand, it can build schools, it can enter into road building programmes, the new high-speed rail network, it can tweak the house building market by interfering with maybe exchange rates or maybe by encouraging councils to grant planning permissions and so on. The government has a huge force in creating demand. It can also influence supply and demand. Again, this is probably, of this list, is the bit the examiner might prefer you to test you on. Price regulation. The government can impose a minimum or a maximum price. And I think sort of alcohol is one of those topics which is very much in the news at the moment. What if the government was to impose a minimum price on alcohol so that we will be discouraged from buying as much because, of course, alcohol is a demerit good. It's bad for us. And of course, a market price, a minimum price, will only have effect if that minimum price is set above the market equilibrium. Another way the government influences supply and demand is through indirect taxation. If we just think for a moment about our basic supply and demand diagram here, remembering that suppliers will supply more, the higher the price of the good, whereas consumers will demand less the higher the price of a good. We can see that if the government was to impose a tax on some goods and services, then supply will be restricted and the supply curve will move to the left like that, which causes a contraction of demand. So we see there the consumers are paying more for their goods, therefore they demand less. And the suppliers, they will supply less because the revenue that's available to them has been reduced. The reverse of that, of course, is subsidies, where the government pays something to the suppliers to encourage them to produce more. So again, we might do this for merit goods to encourage suppliers to supply more merit goods at a lower price. We might do it to protect an industry, something that we see as a special industry that we can't allow to die out in our economy. And for instance, in the notes, the example there is agriculture. The government can be a little bit more subtle. It doesn't have to actually directly regulate the market. It can tweak the market through advertising campaigns, through persuasion. For instance, the current health campaigns, the couch potato adverts, or the government's Get Fit campaigns where it tries to encourage people to join the gym and get out there and have more exercise. Again, that will affect certain markets. For instance, the food industry. You might also find not just might the government influence demand for goods through persuasion, it might also try and influence the supply of goods through persuasion. And if you think about, if you've been into, say, Marks and Spencer's recently, they have big posters up to tell you how they're reducing their sugar content, their salt content, and their hydrogenated fat content. They haven't actually been told they have to do that yet, but the government is liaising with the big food producers to try and persuade them to change their ways ahead of new legislation. So again, persuading the suppliers to change the market. And then failing that, regulation. So if they can't persuade the markets and the customers to behave in the way they'd like them to, then they may well legislate. For instance, again, the stories in the news at the moment about limiting the supply of electronic cigarettes. That would be introducing legislation to try to influence the market. Now, the next 4 bullet points are quite frequently tested, and these are really saying, well, what causes does the government have to regulate a market? Why would it choose to jump in there and regulate? Well, the first one is market imperfection. So we have monopolies. And in the case where we have monopolies, the monopolistic companies pretty much do what they want. That's inefficient and may not lead to a fair allocation of resources. So to combat this market imperfection, the government might intervene. For instance, with controls on prices, on profits. And if you think about the discussions in the news in the last 12-18 months about the utility companies, it's a good example of where the government is trying to intervene with this market imperfection and to try and limit the prices and the profits that these markets make. Externalities is one we've mentioned a lot, and it's one that the examiner quite likes. The government will try to intervene to regulate the market, to make the market consider these external costs, because otherwise they might be overlooked. It's not something that appears on a company's balance sheet without some sort of state intervention to force a company to recognise it. Now, simple things we see in our economy, emissions. So from cars, pollutants from cars. And we see that the government deal with this by using car tax, both your road tax and also the company car tax, which is higher the more polluting your vehicle is, and also through the use of taxes on petrol. So the more petrol you buy, the more duty you will pay. Other examples we've got there, smoking. Smoking is damaging for your health, it's damaging for the health of those around you. And, the legislation really has tightened up on that in recent years. Other things you could see there, compulsory car insurance. You do insure your car not just to protect yourself in the case your car's damaged. The bulk of your car insurance premium actually pays the third-party insurance to protect other people in case you damage their car, or even worse, in case you damage them. Now, the next point there, asymmetric information. What this is talking about really, I mean, asymmetric kind of means uneven, doesn't it? So it's saying where people don't have full access to the information. You'll remember that one of the problems with perfect competition is that the consumer doesn't have perfect information. That means his choice is distorted. He's not able to make a proper decision about what he wants to do. And lots of examples here. Product quality rules, health and safety rules, food hygiene laws, things like that. When you go into a shop and you price up, say, a takeaway sandwich, you've got no way of knowing if your sandwich has been produced in a nice clean kitchen with properly trained staff or whether it's made, in someone's back garden. You can't tell that. So if the government didn't intervene with food, health and safety standards, you wouldn't be able to make a proper decision about whether to buy that cheap sandwich made in the back garden or that nice, healthy, properly prepared sandwich, which might be more expensive. And then finally on this list, we've got equity. Social justice. Now, if the examiner gives you a question that refers to something that seems to you unfair, then the chances are it's the equity option that's the answer. So tax is a good example where the government intervenes for equitable purposes. So it tries to make the rich people pay a larger proportion of the costs of running, say, meeting societies' costs. And again, this is something you'll hear debated in the press all the time at the moment, to do with the higher rate, additional rate tax ban, the 45 pence, 50 pence in the pound debate, which is going on at the moment. And other examples in that sort of social justice category: healthcare, education, fair access to housing, equal pay, race discrimination, all those things, all those pieces of legislation are introduced to try and promote equity within our society. The minimum wage is another one there. So make sure you know those 4 headings and you've got an idea of what might fall within each category. It's an easy exam mark for the examiner to use. Okay, so the other reason we said that the government might wish to intervene in the market is to protect public interest. And we're really looking here at trying to create some sort of balance of power between the needs of the big commercial organisations and the duties it owes to its shareholders and its directors, and also to wider society. So things like the corporate governance rules and increasing corporate social responsibility are quite important under this heading of protecting the public interest. Okay, so what is regulation? Well, if we take regulation sort of as a noun, a regulation is a set of legal rules, and they're often implemented as a form of delegated legislation to support a piece of primary legislation that's been passed by the government. So Parliament may decide that we need a new set of rules about health and safety in the workplace, but the detail of those rules will be filled in by some civil servants who draw up delegated legislation that sets out the fine print and give all the details. That way they will help to implement that primary legislation, but also generally it's easier to tweak regulations as circumstances unfold than it is to go back and amend the primary legislation. Now, again, how do businesses respond to regulation? Well, quite often they kick and scream, they resist. Sometimes they embrace a new set of rules wholeheartedly. Now, there are 4 potential responses to new legislation that have been categorised. And again, because there's 4, it fits very well into a multiple choice format. So I would learn these as well if I were you. So the first one, entrenchment. As we said, that nil response. It's where a business says, we're not doing that, it's too expensive, we're going to try and get away with not complying with these rules. The next one, and we're getting sort of slightly better as we move down this list, is just mere compliance. So the business has done what has been asked of it, but really it's done the minimum. And it's done so by passing on that cost of compliance to its clients and consumers. And you might argue that's a lot of what the utility companies have been doing with the so-called green taxes. They've complied, but literally they've just added the cost of that, passing it on to their consumers. Now, getting better and better, the next one is full compliance. So the business has changed its behaviour completely. It's adjusted its processes and the way it works so that it complies with the legislation. So it's getting good, and that's almost as much as we can hope for from businesses. The final stage of this process, the best response that the government could hope for, would be innovation. So the company, not only has it complied with the regulations, but it's taken things a little step further. It's exceeding the regulations. And what we're really looking at when we're looking at the innovation is that we're looking at new processes. So the business has gone away and looked at how it does things and changed the way it does things. It's not tweaking its existing process, which is more like full compliance, but it's actually completely changed the way it does things. That is innovation. And it's worth mentioning here Porter. I know you're probably fed up of hearing about Porter, but Porter has a theory about the way businesses respond to regulation. And you'd be surprised, wouldn't you, if Porter didn't have a theory. But what he says is particularly about environmental legislation, that it triggers this innovation effect that we just mentioned up here. And by triggering that effect, then businesses will have to become more efficient. They will have to create cost savings. And therefore, overall, competitiveness will be improved as a result of this innovation approach to regulation. Now, we face regulation and regulatory bodies all the time across all sorts of industries. For our purposes now, we're going to look at these two, the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission. Now, just to note, these are still current for your notes, but they are being replaced by something called the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority. So if you see that phrase being mentioned, that's why. It's because they are replacing that competition work of the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission. And we'll look at those in the next lecture.